So hi, Ian Finley here. Today we're going to be continuing our talk about playwriting to talk about what I'm most interested in playwriting, and that is structure, how a play is built. Now, the thing to keep in mind is I have a terrible fear of needles. Because I have a terrible fear of needles, I have no tattoos. If I did have a tattoo, however, it would be this. And I know that was sort of boring and weird and like, what is that? To a writer, this is the most important thing in the world. This is the structure of a well-made play. To a writer, this is life. Everything is in this line. And if you understand this line, you know how to write a good play. And so I will not keep you in suspense. I will tell you in this video and another one how to use this line to make your play. So what this line represents is the journey of the protagonist. You may remember when we talked about conflict, we mentioned this word, protagonist, and we said that the protagonist is the character who creates the agon, the conflict. They are the engine of your play because they're doing something. They want something so badly that they are going to get into all kinds of conflict and overcome all sorts of obstacles trying to get that thing. Typically, they're the main character in your play. Often they're the hero, but they are not always the hero. If your English teacher have said the protagonist is the hero, they're lying to you. The protagonist is the character who wants something and goes for it. Sometimes this is the villain. In the play Othello, for example, by Shakespeare, the main character is the guy the play's named after, Othello, but he's not the protagonist. Othello just reacts to this guy Iago, who's the bad guy. Iago wants something. Iago wants to destroy Othello, and so he's constantly doing all these things and causing all these things to happen. So sometimes your protagonist is your bad guy. In the play Fences, for example, the main character is a guy named Troy, but he's not the protagonist because he's dead for the last scene. The protagonist is actually his wife. His wife, Rose, even though she doesn't have as much time on stage, is the character who wants something and is trying to get something and is causing the play to move forward, even though she's on stage less than the other person. So the protagonist, usually your main character, usually your hero, but not always. They're the character who wants something. So this arc represents their journey through the play. We call this sometimes linear structure because you can draw a line that represents it. If you wanted to be really fancy, you could call this Aristotelian structure. Aristotelian structure, because it comes from Aristotle. That Aristotle guy we talked about a long time ago, he watched a lot of plays, and he observed that in the best plays, there was a protagonist, and the protagonist followed the line like that. So we sometimes call it Aristotelian structure, and you can impress people with that because it's got lots of syllables. But the important thing is we hold to this pattern, not because Aristotle said it was good, but because it will keep the audience interested. This is a surefire way of making sure that the audience is with you, because audiences get bored really quickly. Maybe you're bored right now. I will do my best to change that. But this is a machine for making sure your character is not bored. So let me show you how that works. We take our protagonist. Here he is at the beginning of the play. He's a happy protagonist. And he's happy because there's not too much going on in his life. For the first little bit of the play, it's flat. We call this the stasis because it stays the same. It's the same root, if you're interested in that, as the word stable, stasis. Not stable where you keep horses, but stable as in not changing. So for the first about 10% of the play, not a lot changes. And we use that stasis to introduce characters to the audience, to introduce the world, to sort of set everything up for the audience. Because once the plot starts happening, the audience is going to be trying to figure out what's going on and follow the plot and see all these obstacles. So we want to make sure that the characters and their relationships are clear at the beginning before the plot starts. We call that the stasis. And it's roughly 10% of your play. You don't want it to be too long because the audience will get bored without plot. So what starts the plot? It's this little moment here. This moment has a fancy name. We call it the inciting incident. And you can remember that because both of those words begin with the letters I and C, the ink, inciting incident. Not exciting incident, although it sometimes is exciting, but inciting, which means to start something. So what happens at the inciting incident? Well, it's really simple. The inciting incident is the moment that the protagonist's want is revealed. That is what it means. The inciting incident means the moment that the want is revealed. If you don't have a protagonist with a want, you don't have a play. So you can't have an inciting incident. You must have a want for the protagonist, and that want has to become clear to the audience. And that's what this moment is about. The inciting incident is about making that want clear to the audience. Because as soon as that want is clear, the audience is going to be hooked with a question. And that is, will this character get that thing that they want? And now we've hooked them with the question. They will be interested for the next hour or 2 hours while we tell our story. Until that want is given there, until we've hooked them with that question, is he going to get what he wants or not, then they don't know why they're watching. As soon as you've hooked them with this question, suddenly we know, oh, that's the main character, that's the person I should be watching, because I want to know, does he get the want or not? And so that starts this slope where you've got your protagonist trying to get what they want. And it's not easy. In fact, it gets harder and harder. Every time they overcome one obstacle, that solution leads to another obstacle. About midway through, it gets really steep. We sometimes call this the point of transformation. Or sometimes we call it the complication, because the conflict gets bigger there. There's some new thing that happens that makes it even harder to get what they want. We'll talk more about that in another video. But up here, we finally get to this moment. We call this moment the climax. It's from the Greek word meaning ladder, so it's the top of the ladder. The climax has a very specific definition, and it's different than what you may have heard in your English classes. In a short story or novel, the climax is sort of the turning point, like the point of transformation is in the play. In a play, the climax is the moment that the protagonist either gets what they want or they don't. That's what climax means. If they get to the climax and it's not clear whether the protagonist got what they wanted or not, then that's not the climax. You can't have a play without these two pins. We get the audience interested here. Is the character going to get what they want? And then we resolve that question here at the climax. And then you notice it's got this little teeny tail. This is very short. It's about 5% of the overall length. And we call this the falling action. You can also, if you want to be very sort of French and pretentious, you can call it the denouement, which is a fancy word of saying falling action in French. But basically all the falling action is it wraps up the story, and it shows us the consequences of the protagonist getting that want or not getting that want. And it's really short, because once the want has been achieved, the audience, that question that's been keeping them in their seats and keeping them interested has been answered, so they want to go home. So this needs to be quite short to keep them from just leaving the theater because you've answered the question. Another way of saying all of this, and I sort of alluded to this before, is that there's a question that's planted in the audience's head here. That question is so important we have a special name for it. We call it the major dramatic question, or just the MDQ. And every single play has one. And it is posed at the inciting incident, and it's answered at the climax. And it's that question that keeps the audience interested. And the question is always, will blank get blank? And that first one is the protagonist, and that second blank is what they want. Every single good play has this, because this question, planted in the audience's brain, is going to keep them interested. In the play Oedipus Rex, there's been a plague, and Oedipus the king says, okay, it's fine, I've sent someone to find out how to cure this plague, and Creon comes back and says, you just need to find the murderer of the last king, Laius. And so suddenly, we have a want. Oedipus wants to find the murderer. So the major dramatic question is, will Oedipus get the murderer? In the play Hamlet, Hamlet's upset, he's going along, but we don't know exactly what the problem is until Hamlet's father's ghost comes back and says, hey, by the way, your uncle killed me, go kill him. Suddenly, Hamlet's got a want. Will Hamlet get to kill his uncle? And that question then drives us through the rest of the play. We're willing to watch the play, and there could be subplots that go off in other places. There could be romantic issues, like in Hamlet. There could be issues of faith and belief, like in Oedipus Rex, but we're interested because we're waiting to see, will this question be answered? And at the climax, the question is always answered, and the answer is always yes or no. It's one of those two. If it's maybe, that's not your climax. The climax is defined as the moment where the major dramatic question is answered and it's always yes or no. If it's anything else, the audience is going to be confused. You may have gone to movies before and you've watched it and like the acting's good but it doesn't seem to go anywhere and then it just sort of ends. We've all seen movies like that. That's because either there wasn't a clear inciting incident or there wasn't a clear climax. And so now when you walk out of the movie theater and say, oh, well, it was good, it just didn't go anywhere, now you know why. Either this question was not put into your brain at the beginning to hook you, or it wasn't answered and resolved at the end. But if you have those two things, if you have a moment here at the beginning, the inciting incident where want is really strongly posed, and then a moment here at the end, a climax where that want is resolved, it's like the pins on the end of a clothesline, if anyone still uses a clothesline. You have those two hooks and they hold the whole thing up and they keep it taut and they keep it from sagging. You can't have just one of them because otherwise it would sag on the ground. You've got to have both, the inciting incident and the climax. And you get those things, the rest of the structure will be held up between them. So that's an introduction. We'll talk more about structure later because it's interesting, but that is an introduction to these ideas.